Hi, this is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to a brand new episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And joining me today is our special guest, the Midship Mama, Stacey Wallenstein. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so before we get started, could you let the audience know who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So, my name is Stacey, and I am a blogger and content creator. And my blog and social channels are called The Mint Chip Mama. And I am a parenting, lifestyle, food, beauty, travel blogger and content creator. And I also have leaned a lot into women's health lately, a lot about perimenopause. And I've always stayed authentic and organic, basically talking about whatever was in front of me. So when my kids were younger, that was toys, and now it's perimenopause. So
Okay.
I try to just present everything in a fun, light way and have a good time with the content that I create.
Okay, that's good. Thank you so much. So the film that she picked for us today is the 1995 teen comedy Clueless, directed and written by Amy Heckerling, starring Alicia Silverstone, Paul Rudd, Stacey Dash, and Brittany Murphy. So why did you pick this film?
So this is one of my absolute favorite films of all time, and I do a lot of podcasts, and they always ask me what my favorite film is. And despite it being from 1995, it's still one of my favorites. And I rewatched it last night so I could have fresh notes. And I will say also, Alicia Silverstone is big on social media, and she mentioned how it's the 30th anniversary of the movie. And I was like, oh my God. I remember sitting in the theater with my friend watching it in high school, and it's just incredible that it's had such an impact on the culture. And I picked it for many different reasons. And in watching it last night, after not seeing it for a couple of years, it's just so funny how teenagers are teenagers in the 90s or the aughts or the 80s or 2025. They care about makeup, they care about clothes, they care about their friends, they care about, girls and boys and girls and parties and lying to their parents. And, it's such a timeless classic. And also in listening last night to a movie I've seen so many times, to hear how many times each of them call the other clueless, which is just
Mm,
funny. Just kind of now, I have a 15-year-old daughter who's like almost the same age as the main characters are in the show. And just thinking about how they are so adorably clueless about so many things, because even though they're big people, they're big children, they're still children, and
mm.
they don't know all that is in the world. And it's a movie that I was waiting to show my daughter. And then when I finally did, it was so exciting to share that with her.
Mm.
And I remember a couple years ago when I did, she was like, I understand you so much more now, which I thought was so funny. But
Yes.
even like lines that my husband's the same age as me and loves the movie too, and so many of the lines that we just like say in our everyday vernacular come from that movie, and it's just so funny that this movie had such an impact on us that like, and it's still going so strong, and it's such an icon of style and music, and just like a real look at like teenage youth at that time,
Mm.
that it's just I love the movie so much.
Yes. Well, I can understand. I mean, I was born in the 90s. I may have seen this maybe later after its release. And this is so like of that decade. You have MTV, they reference movie stars, they reference fashion, they reference whatever was
Hmm.
in what it was out. And as you mentioned, they have a vernacular that um I don't know if teens like that talk like they do in the movie nowadays. But yeah, I can totally understand. This is like the Gen X movie of the 90s, whereas whatever movie or TV show is made now, it's like this is
Hmm.
their version of that. But yeah,
Yes.
it's like that. I mean, they mentioned like as I mentioned, movies, MTV, music. They have ska music, they have rap music, pop music, all types of
Yeah.
whatever was big at the time, and
Yeah.
all and as you mentioned, it's a as you mentioned, the movie Clueless was or the title Clueless was mentioned a few times in the voiceover scenes. So what would you say is your favorite character like relationship in the movie, like between the main characters, between the boyfriend, the girlfriend? What would you say was your favorite like relationship in the movie that you thought was powerful or dynamic?
I mean, I feel like it's kind of lame to say Sharon Josh, but it's like I mean, I love Paul Rudd, and we were laughing because last night my husband, like, he does not look like an inch older than he does right now, which is incredible.
Hmm.
But I mean, obviously, I think it's adorable how they want to manipulate the teachers. And when they start doing the voiceover of Mr. Hall, they say he's 47 and that's how old I am. And my husband, who very much likes to point out, how old I am all the time, just to make me feel bad,
Yeah.
says, pauses it, and he goes, "Did you hear what they just said? They said Mr. Hall is 47," and I like punched him. But I was like, oh
Mm.
God. But I mean, I think that that's really cute. I think that they, genuinely want to be nice, even though they want to be getting something out of it, which is very much what the teenagers in 2025 and in 1975 and in 2053 will do. They see their goal and they want to manipulate the adults to get what they want, and it's just funny. I actually love the relationship between Cher and her dad, and I
Mhm.
love like when he like gives her a look or like gives Josh a look when he can tell that they totally like each other. I love
Mhm.
that he's super overprotective. I love the scene where she says, where she comes to him with a report card and he goes, "Wait, you argued your way from a C plus to an A minus. I couldn't have been more proud of you if it was based on actual merit." And that's one of the lines that like my husband and I joke all the time about. We always
Mhm.
say like that one, and then also like the ticket was the first notice. But I want to go back to something you spoke about where you talk about how it's such like a snapshot into like that time period.
Mhm.
So one of the things they say, which now of course 30 years later is funny, they talk about Marky Mark planning a celebrity tree for this organization that Josh is
Mm.
involved with, and she goes, "Thank God that Marky Mark is taking a busy schedule from his pants dropping, schedule, a busy moment from his busy pants dropping schedule to plant a
Mhm.
tree." Now what's funny about that specific is Marky Mark, who is Marky Mark in the Funky Bunch, then has become Mark Wahlberg, the successful actor and entrepreneur and inspiration for shows like Encore or Entourage.
Entourage. Yeah.
And it's just like you think of Marky Mark dropping his pants to plant a tree, and then you think of Entourage, where this entire empire was built around like this guy who's so cool and brings his friends. And Mark Wahlberg has become such a success both in television and in restaurants and so many things that it's just funny that they give him a jab because at that point he was Marky Mark from Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. So I just
Mm.
thought that was funny.
Mm.
Um, but like I some of the notes that I took because I just was laughing and I know this movie so well, but it's just funny to like go back and look at it thinking about it from a 30 years ago lens and discussing it. So I wrote like the teenagers are the same, but the phones have evolved. So it's funny to see that they all have like their Nokia phones, analog phones, right?
Mhm.
Nobody has beepers anymore. There's one scene where they're going to the party in the valley and they're looking at a map, and I'm just laughing at the fact how like our kids won't know from looking at maps to try to figure out where this random party is in the valley, right?
Mhm.
Um, she talks about all the different cliques, but it's the same as like friend groups now, where it's all the different people. Now they call it friend groups.
Mhm.
Um, they have their scene where they're having a debate class and they're talking about all these big topics, and those topics are still being discussed today, maybe different players, but the overall, concept the same. I like I said before, I love the line where she's talking about her grades and they're all starting off points because when I was in school, when before the movie, I feel like you get your grade and that's it. And I feel like after the movie, I was like, wait, you could try to talk to your teachers and like negotiate better grades. And I did that and I had grades changed. And
Mhm.
I always say to my daughter too, like the grade is just the jumping off point. Like you absolutely can negotiate.
Mhm.
And then like some of the other things, like she has a Starbucks with her, which obviously, we're in like such a Starbucks and Sephora culture right now. She
Mhm.
blames her period on everything, which teenagers still are doing. She goes, "Mr. Hall, I was surfing the Crimson Wave."
Mhm.
Um, and then even just like certain things that they say that like now in the name, like certain words that we now don't use, like the R word that now is seen as such a faux pas, but like back then was just used so regularly. Like that, there are certain things that are absolute like time frame snapshots.
Mhm.
And then certain things that have evolved to what they are now, and certain things that like now, we always joke. I have blog posts about like the best 80s and 90s movies to watch with your families. And I have a note in both articles talking about how the rating system of the 80s and 90s is very different than the rating system today.
Mhm.
So, like, I've watched movies with my kids from these lists, and they're like, "I can't believe they're saying that. You don't let us say those words." And I'm like, well, kind of in the 80s and 90s, all different things were said, and nobody really had a problem with it. And it's just, it's funny, that stuff. And then some of the other lines that I wrote down that we like still repeat, like when they get to the party in the valley and she goes, "Let's do a lap before committing to a location." I don't think I've gone to a party since 1995 where I haven't immediately said that when I've entered the party. It's like so much of like built into me. And the ticket when I mentioned, and then when he says, "Is that a dress according to who?" And she says, "Calvin Klein." That's always a joke that my husband and I make now, having a teenage daughter, sometimes dressing in clothes akin to her beautiful white Calvin Klein dress. And she comes downstairs and we're like, "What is that?" And then my husband will say, "It's a dress according to Calvin Klein." Um, and then also I was saying like I love the scene where like the dad gives Josh like the smile, telling when he's leaving for the party and saying I should go and watch her just to keep an eye on her, and the dad like totally can see that. Like sometimes the adult sees the kids, flirting with each other, but they don't quite get that.
Hmm.
And then the last one I have, which I was just laughing at, is still to this day how stressful it is to merge on the highway. And and when they're going freeway, freeway, I like when I merge into a busy highway, I always get a little flustered, and my daughter's always making fun of me, and I'm always like freeway. But it's just crazy how this movie like was such an icon, and I feel like to so many people my generation just became this like incredible. And also I think that it was very validating because it was teenagers, and it was, I had a very different life than her. I had a very different house than her. I didn't have a lumped out Jeep like her. But, just the dynamics of the friendships and going to the mall, and, they went to go see the new Christian Slater. And then there was just Christian Slater was just in like the Dexter reboot, and I was talking to my daughter about it because he was like being interviewed on something we were watching, and I was like, the line where she goes, "We can blow off Eighth and go see the new Christian Slater." That's Christian Slater, and she's like, "Oh my god." So I feel like so much like random pop culture references come from that movie,
Hmm.
and whether like people realize it and they say it or they don't, I just like it's just been such a fun movie all these years, and it just gives me, even just hearing like the first few bars of like Kids in America just brings me back to such a simpler, happy place.
Yeah, it does. And and it's interesting because you mentioned that a lot of the vernacular and also a lot of the things that you couldn't say anymore from that decade has changed because maybe of our insensitivities and things
Mm-hmm.
that maybe people don't like. So the other thing I liked about this movie was that the main protagonist, Cher, and she has her best friend in the film played by Stacey Dash named Dion, and
Mm-hmm.
she mentioned in her voiceover that they were named after popular singers. I like that Cher said that she was trying to have excuse me, the Brittany Murphy character, and I think this was one of her earliest leading roles before she became the star that she was before she died in 2009. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I thought she was really like almost close to the age her character was, like around 16 or 17 or 18 when she made this movie. That she was like I think she was from like the Midwest or maybe she had like a country background because
New
of the way
Jersey. Yes.
New Jersey, sorry, New Jersey because she's from the East Coast and because of the way that she was wearing her dress, they were trying to give her a makeover, they were trying to make her look popular and they were trying and it was like sort of giving like My Fair Lady vibes. Like they were trying to make her into they were trying to turn the flower girl into a My Fair Lady, this proper lady, but
Yeah.
they were trying to turn it into the popular girls. And also I liked that she was trying to find a boyfriend for Ty that she would go out with. And then this was before the party in Sun Valley. She was
Mm-hmm.
gonna pair him up with Elton,
Mm-hmm.
and
God, Elton, can't you suck? Yes.
yes, yes, and I thought it was a pretty interesting, like, sort of coming of age teen comedy as well, because it was basically about she was trying to fit in, she was trying to understand what goes on in Beverly Hills, because I think that's where the movie takes place. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like she's surprised that they have sodas. They have sodas in the cafeteria. They have this, they have that. And it's like I think she mentioned that where she came from, she didn't have that sort of stuff there. But now that she's trying to fit in, it's almost like
Right.
she's adapting to this new
Yeah.
environment. And she does it almost throughout the entire movie. Like they gave her new clothing to
Mm-hmm.
wear. change her hairstyle. They give her like lipstick. And the way she talks, it's also changing as well as you watch the movie, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, she says you guys have Coke, and I think she means like cocaine. And they're like, yeah, we have Coke. And so it's funny. It's adorable. I mean, obviously, it's based on Emma, which is a Jane Austen movie, but I definitely see the My Fair Lady. But
Mhm.
it's 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 just such a feel good movie, I think. And then I love how it ends with the wedding, and she's like, oh my God, it's not me, And then it's just I feel like everything about it is just such a smile. And then I think also for me, not so much for you because you obviously saw it for the first time as somebody that was older instead of as a teenage girl about the
Oh,
same age. It just, it was like one of those movies from that time period that just really made a teenager feel seen and heard. And
hmm
I feel like the next time I had a reaction to a movie like that was Mean Girls, which was a couple years later, which
hmm
I'd love to come back and talk about because I love that movie too. But
Oh,
like those two movies always, and that was a couple years later when I was like a college graduate. So I was like in my early 20s at that point. But
mhm.
those two movies always stood out to me as just really just true teenage girl, not even like angst because it's not angsty like Heather's, which I love as well, but like just kind of like happy, feel good. I feel like the soundtrack just makes you think of like skipping.
Yeah.
And now a message from Jordan Ramirez for Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez.
I want to take a break from this episode to thank my listeners/viewers who watch the videos on my YouTube channel and listen to each new episode on Spotify. While this show is a labor of love and passion that isn't about the movies that I like, this is also a show that is about the films that you like. Have a film that you want to recommend to the podcast? Make sure to recommend it in the comments section on YouTube and on Spotify, and you will receive a shout out in a future episode. Want to be a guest on the podcast? Click on the sign up form link in the episode description for further details. If you like this episode or my previous episodes, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more interviews in the near future. The goal for this channel is to reach up to 100 subscribers both on YouTube and on Spotify. It's just that easy. And now, back to our regularly scheduled episode. Now we're gonna move on to the writer and director of the film, Amy Heckerling, who not only directed this film, but she also directed Fast Times at Ridgemont High back in
Mm-hmm.
'82. So what did you think that this movie was directed by a woman director who not only wrote the story but also directed the film, like from a woman's perspective? What did you think was interesting about that?
I mean, I think that the dynamics of portraying female relationships, the negatives and the positives, and I love the line where she goes, "Would you call me selfish?" to Dion, and Dion goes, "Not to your face." Like that's so how a woman's relationship, especially as a teenager, is. And again, like I said, I see this with my daughter, how they're all best friends and they all turn on each other and then they all come back around and then they're all together. And I was watching last night the like extra scenes. I watched it on a DVD. I'm still a
Hmm.
DVD watcher. And one of the interviews with Amy Heckerling was talking, or I'm sorry, with Breckin Meyer was talking about how I guess they didn't want to make his character too much like Jeff Spicoli in Fast Time.
Hmm.
So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. And I don't know how I never watched the interviews with them before because I'm surprised I haven't. But I think it's awesome. I mean, I think Fast Time was with Ridgemont High. Fast Time at Ridgemont High is similar that it has such a great perspective and it's such a great story. I feel like that's told more as like an overall teenager perspective, but I feel like Clueless, especially with the colors and pink and, the dynamic of the three of them and then the friend that's kind of like the frenemy with Amber, who's like the friend but not the friend, but then the friend again. Um, I think that's just so I think that a woman needed to tell that story to be as effective and correct and emotionally like variant as it would be. Like I don't think a man has the same, teenage obviously they wouldn't have the same teenage girl experience in high school that a woman would, just as the
Hmm.
same as a woman wouldn't have one of a man. But I think
Yeah.
it's awesome.
Yeah,
And
it
at that
is.
time, I think it was a really big deal for a woman to be charged with such a big, studio film. And I think that was awesome.
It is. So would you say this film is different from, let's say, the John Hughes teen comedies that he made maybe in the same period? Or is it what would you say is similar to those type of John Hughes movies, and maybe what would you say is a little bit different from his movies to this film that you took into account?
So I love that question. And I love it for so many reasons. But one of them is that last night after the movie, I was thinking about that exact question. And I was thinking that the John Hughes movies were predominantly like 80s. So it was much more like 80s fashion and maybe early 90s. Um, but I feel like the John Hughes movies, first of all, most of them were set in like an Illinois type frame.
Hmm.
I think that like I feel like they had a big like teenage suburbia feel, whereas I felt like Clueless was more like Beverly Hills and fancy and palm trees, and I feel like the overall like look was a little bit different. But I feel like the John Hughes movies really tackled very often like the awkward stages of teenagers, and I feel like many teenagers felt seen and heard by them because they were like the awkward wallflower, or they were the geek, or they were the Molly Ringwald character, or they knew them, or in like obviously in the famous Breakfast Club where each of them have a character. And I feel like that was so about like the awkwardness of teenage years and trying to find your way. Whereas Clueless, I feel like quite the opposite. They were like, we're gorgeous. We wear all this fancy clothes. We're like, driving these fancy cars. It like, I think it went from like suburban Illinois awkwardness in 80s style to like lavish, grandiose 90s pink, bright colors, you know, and it could be because it was 10 years later, or it could just be, it was just a totally different style. And even the music. And like, I love John Hughes music. And I think that they have some of the best soundtracks of any of the movies ever made. And still, I'm brought back to so many of those movies and those moments, and they're on my like favorite list. But I feel like that, I feel like the John Hughes genre was like more emotional and like, it hit you in a way that you felt it like in your bones, and you're like, I totally get it. I've been there. I feel it. I'm finally being seen and heard. Whereas with Clueless, while it's similar to that, it also is like a celebration of like the absurdity of being a teenage girl,
Hmm.
and the different things that they talk about. And I'll tell you what's funny is they're 16 in the movie, or they're almost, I guess they're 15 turning 16 maybe,
Hmm.
and the stuff that they talk about, like, I guess because I was that age when it all happened, I didn't feel like they were young to be discussing this. And now when I'm watching it as an 47-year-old, now that I'm Mr.
Hmm.
Hall's age, I'm looking at it and it's like, I can't believe that this is what these kids are doing and discussing. And I actually finished, I started watching the movie with my husband and he went to sleep. And then I continued to watch it with my daughter. And the movie ended and I turned to her and I was like, what about that with you and or your friends? And she's like, no, no, no. And I'm like, okay. But I mean, obviously something, some things never change about teenagers and house parties and what they do that their mothers don't want to know about. But I feel like the John Hughes stuff was a little bit more innocent.
Hmm.
And again, like to be fair, I was born in 78. So the John Hughes stuff to me is probably like the Clueless to you, in that I watched them all like afterwards when I was older, not as they were like out in the movie theaters, because it was a little like it was about teenagers in the mid 80s when I was like under 10. So it wasn't like resonating with me as like a peer. Whereas
Hmm.
Clueless, it was absolutely like that's what my life was at that time. Well, I wish that was my life, but that was much more of like what I was, going through as a teenage girl.
Hmm. Yeah. So I wanted to bring this up because I know I know that Clueless was made in 95, and as I mentioned, they mentioned a lot of like references, and they do feature like clips of Ren and Stimpy and Beavis and Butthead, two of the biggest cartoons of that time. Um, I grew up in the early 90s. I was born in the early 90s. I grew up in the late 90s and 2000s. And one of the shows I remember watching when I was a kid was Rocko's Modern Life, which was part of that same decade. And that was sort of like my influence into like absorbing that type of culture. Like the 90s, I think it was like not just as you mentioned, it was an era of happy film, like feel good movies and also creative movies at that time. But it was also like I always thought that some of the TV shows and movies were a little bit like trying to be edgy because the 90s, when you watch commercials or maybe TV shows from that time, it was supposed to be like after the 80s, it was supposed to be like the next big thing. It was supposed to be a little bit edgy. It was supposed to be a little bit next wave, like the next step, what was going on in that decade, and every TV show that was going on I remembered some of those shows growing up in the late 90s and early 2000s when those types of movies and TV shows were coming out. As you mentioned, the Nokia phones and the beepers, the pagers. I may have remembered seeing commercials of it growing up,
Yeah.
but I experienced that in that decade. It was like I knew what it was, but I just didn't know what to do with it at the time.
Yeah.
And but it was something I remembered and I cherished. And it was also being born in the early 90s. It was also the era of the Disney Renaissance. It was the era
Hmm.
when Disney
Yeah.
movies were, big
Yeah.
again. They were making box office hits. They were on
Hmm.
VHS tapes and yeah, just going back to the 1990s and maybe the early 2000s, it's like that was that sort of period that I grew up in that was innocent, that was bright, and you could make those types of movies then. I don't know if you could do them today
Yeah.
with what's going on in Hollywood, but yeah, it's a really
Yeah.
amazing time capsule.
Yeah, and it's funny because there's a couple, like the line about Marky Mark is funny because he has gone on to such success. But then they also have a line about Kato, which, when Paul Rudd is eating something out of her refrigerator and she says, like, I don't know, Kato. And that's a reference to Kato Kalin, who lived in OJ Simpson's house,
Ooh.
who, if you lived through all of that, right? So, like, if you're my 15-year-old daughter and you watch that, you wouldn't, like, it would fly right over your head, but it's a very big pop culture reference that at the time during the OJ Simpson case, when he had this like guy living at his house and everyone knew Kato Kalin was like the loaf that stayed in your house. Like it just is a funny, like there's so much pop culture referenced in that movie that you either catch or don't.
Hmm.
Um, but I agree with you. And then even when you think about TV, like I totally agree, like Ren and Stimpy, which of course is way existential, as she says, but like Beavis and Butthead and Ren and Stimpy, and they were both shows that were cartoons, but obviously very much geared towards adults because a lot of the stuff was like next level or
Hmm.
funny and offensive, but in a loving way or a not loving way. But then you can kind of juxtapose that with all of this episodic family, television that was like the TGIF on Friday night on ABC, like, Full House and Perfect Stranger, which I guess is probably more of like the late 80s, early 90s. But like you have, Family Matters, all of these warm and fuzzy step by step, family value shows. And then you have these kind of like cutting edge MTV cartoons. And I feel like, a movie like Reality Bites is a really great combination of all of that, where it's like the warm and fuzzies, but also like they're trying to push to this like next level 90s, MTV amplified type thing. And I think that's why Clueless stands out over all of these 30 years as being kind of this like warm pink heart in all of it, because it is this like feel good, warm and fuzzy. There's nothing nasty about it. There's no cutting edge about it, except like I said, for some of the words she uses that in today's society would be deemed, not appropriate.
Hmm.
Um, but of the time it was, no one thought twice about using them. So it's like in hindsight type thing. But I think that's just why it has been popular for all these years. And why if I see like yellow plaid, I immediately think of Cher, and that closet still, even
Hmm.
though there's probably that technology now, is still like the coolest. Like still as a 47-year-old woman, I aspire to be like Cher Horowitz.
Yes. Okay, so you mentioned some of your favorite lines and your favorite scenes. Do you have any like final thoughts or statements about this film? And then maybe I could jump in afterwards.
Oh my God, I love Josh. No, I mean, I just think that like I probably didn't need to rewatch it to study for this podcast, but also I was so excited to rewatch it because I haven't watched it in maybe a year or two. And it just makes me so happy. And I feel like having some space between the viewings made the things that maybe are kind of waning in knowledge of pop culture for the next generation make them stand out so more to me, like the Cato line, or like the fact that they say Clueless so often, which I never, realized, or, even like you were saying, different pop culture things, like they have the Mentos commercial in there, and it's like they don't show that commercial anymore, but that was such an iconic commercial of the decade that it's just funny.
Yeah,
Um,
Mentos, the fresh maker.
yeah.
Yes. Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, so I like Paul Rudd in this film. I know this wasn't his first leading role. He did a previous television movie, I think, before he did this movie, but now he's gone on to be, one of the biggest movie stars slash television actors of
Hmm.
now. And it's pretty interesting that some of the actors who started out in smaller or supporting roles, now they've gone on to do bigger things nowadays. And
Yeah.
I I don't know if this might be something that's a little bit out of my mind, but I just thought of it now. Whenever I see Alicia Silverstone's character narrating, she kind of reminds me of a female Ferris Bueller in some way, I guess, because Ferris
So it's funny
Bueller.
that yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
No, no, because I was just thinking about this just as we were talking that I mentioned the John Hughes can sort of similarities. That she almost makes me think of Ferris Bueller because, like Ferris Bueller, she talks directly to the audience and she informs the audience and she gives exposition into who the other characters are and what she's thinking in her head. So I kind of thought that as we were talking.
I mean, I think of all the long lists of John Hughes movies that there are, Ferris Bueller, I think, is always considered one of the front runners. And I think it's probably for everything that you outlined. And it's almost like Ferris is to the 80s as Clueless is to the 90s for all the reasons, which is honestly why Mean Girls is to the early aughts, right? I feel like there's similarities. And in Mean Girls as well, she narrates and she talks to the camera. And, you have that like fourth wall connection or whatever it's called with the character.
Breaking the
And
fourth
I
wall, but yeah.
breaking the fourth wall, that's what I'm trying to say. And I think with Ferris, he's the villain but you're all rooting for him. And it's when you watch that movie now and you're like, wait, the principal came to his house and was trying to break in, that does not sound okay.
Hmm.
It's funny to watch that now because that movie completely stands the test of time. And similar, it has such iconic moments where, I remember I went to school in the Midwest, and when I went to the Chicago Art Museum, I called my best friend and he played the song that's playing in Ferris Bueller when they're staring at the painting at the Chicago
Hmm.
Art Institute or whatever the museum is. But it's like that movie has so many spectacular moments, and I totally see the way that syncs up with Clueless so much more than like 16 Candles or Breakfast Club
Yeah.
or Weird Science or any of those. I definitely I can see the similarities.
Yes, I started to notice it as we were talking too. And so the other thing I would mention, because we're almost running out of time. Um,
Okay.
okay. Um, I mentioned the pop culture references. It was around the era that you had like Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction coming out, and you had like I think it was like sort of like in the era of what we would now call postmodern cinema, where they would reference movies or TV shows. And sorry, it's my dog. She's
That's
barking
okay.
at yeah. Yeah. Okay. And it's like every time you see a movie, they would always reference something maybe as pop culture or TV, as we
Hmm.
mentioned earlier. And another show that I watched, it's around the same time, but maybe people are not fans of it, Mystery Science Theater. They always reference pop culture and TV. So
An excellent
Clueless,
one.
yes. So I think it's in that same era, like it was known as the era of the postmodern movies where they were now no longer going in the traditional modern methods. They were now going like postmodern, referencing, spoofing, doing whatever they
Yeah.
could to reference. But I think it was part of that decade and that period. So before we wrap things up, what would you say are your recommendations or pairings with this film, and where can my audience find you?
So I love that you brought up Ferris because I feel like that would be like if you think of Clueless in the middle in the 90s, I love the idea of Ferris Bueller in the 80s, and I love the idea of Mean Girls in the aughts. And even just like one of the movies that I watched recently was oh God, I can't remember the name. It was a 90s movie, but I had never watched it. Drop Dead Gorgeous. Drop Dead
Okay.
Gorgeous, which was a crazy movie, and I never saw it. We watched it, and I was like, "This is fabulous! How did it take me all these years to watch it?" But just so in fact, as a segue, coupling both of those, I have, like I mentioned before, an article of family-friendly 80s movies and family-friendly 90s movies with all of these listed on it with ratings, and the time frames are listed, and they're broken out by years, so you can go down one by one, and so you can find those all at the Mint Chip Mama, MAMA.com. And then you can find me across all social channels at the Mint Chip Mama. And I actually talk a lot about 80s and 90s pop culture. I've gone to 90s Con the last couple of years in Connecticut and covered that as like from a press perspective. And there is such a boom right now of 90s nostalgia. And I
Mm.
think a lot of it is covering, stuff that we talked about and just feel good stuff. And, we are now, well, not you, but me and my people in our 40s are, of that generation now where our kids are the age that we were when all of these things were on our TV screens. And I think in kind of connecting with them, we're also like reconnecting with our own youth and, going back to the time where it was just so much fun. And, you had to go to Blockbuster and, get the, I don't know if you remember that at all. You might be
Oh
too
no,
young
I
for that,
remember
but like,
Blockbuster a lot. I remembered it a lot.
okay, perfect. So it's like, on a Friday night, you wanted to go with your friend, you needed your parent to drive you to Blockbuster, and then you needed to run to the new releases and then hope that there was one behind the box. And then, you rented it and then you had to rewind it, be kind, rewind, and then return it. And it was such a thing. And it's funny now that you just press a button and it pops up, or you
Mm.
don't even have to go to the movie theater anymore. And the movie you can get the same day. And it's just, I like still getting DVDs. I order them from the library like an old fart. And I'm so like, I love the process and I love like, the tangibility of it. And I don't know, it's something that I joke about. Like my friend, everyone makes fun of me, and I'm totally okay with that. But it's just, I think that little connection makes the movies even more special. Like I think Clueless is on one of the 8,000 streaming services we pay for every month,
Mm.
but I still took my little DVD out of the cabinet and put it
Mm.
in and then looked at all the extra features and like
Yeah.
that just made me happy.
Yeah, physical media all the way. I always th say physical media is best when you preserve it, because you can own it instead of having to license or borrow it. I
Yeah,
still use DVDs and I still have VHS tapes.
I love that.
I still love VHS tapes, and
Yeah,
I still have a VHS DVD like
yeah.
machine
Yeah,
that I
and
always use.
I have all the 90s Disney special edition VHS tapes that you just mentioned, The Lion King and Aladdin and Little
Mm.
Mermaid, and they're like big fat plastic cases when they did the
Yeah.
re-release and all of that. So,
Mm.
but I agree, I definitely think that there's something to be said about holding it in your hands and just feeling that connection and, just that tactile connection to like a happier, simpler time.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being on the
Yes.
podcast.
Can I take a picture of us before we go? Do you mind just
Okay.
smiling so we can, and then perfect. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and I hope that we meet each other soon. So this is Jordan
Absolutely.
Ramirez. Yes, thank you. This is Jordan Ramirez signing off, and until then, I'll see you at the movies. And Stacy, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Take care.